Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and welcome to this episode of Cracking Addiction. And once again, we have Mr. Stephen Hurd with us. Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really well, thanks, Fergal.
So I thought today we'd continue our discussion on the evidence-based risk factors for lethality in the context of family violence. In the previous episode, we touched on the following risk factors of strangulation, escalation, stalking, and pregnancy. So let's explore a few more risk factors. In my mind, I've also got separation, the escape plan. The escape plan and enactment of the escape plan can also cause significant family violence risks.
A really delicate time, a really delicate observation, and it's mixed up in that idea that question that clinicians may have, practitioners may have, that if family violence is going on, why doesn't she leave? And that question was probably the first point of call to try and understand family violence years ago. But the real question is, well, why doesn't he stop his behaviour?
Yeah.
But that's not to say, well, okay, but let's get back to the separation aspect again. Separation is known to be a really dangerous time for women in terms of that moment of separation, the fear of separation, so leading up to separation. If the controlling partner fears that loss, his behaviours can escalate in that time frame of that threat or the act of leaving. But we also know that even if it's successful, that family violence continues post-separation. Just because separation might occur doesn't mean the violence is going to stop. It can easily escalate, and you mentioned other behaviours before around stalking, and that's when that might really escalate.
Yeah.
But one of the
go on, sorry.
Yeah, but one of the key bits of advice we need to sort of keep telling ourselves is that we as clinicians, we're outsiders to this person's life. We want to make them safe. We want them to connect with the police. We want them to connect with perhaps the orange door. We want them to leave. That's what we want, because I'll feel better because of that. But that isn't what her view will be. Her view will be, I'm too scared, I'm too petrified to leave. Because if I do, I don't know, well, he'll kill me.
Yeah.
And so
that's not an idle threat, and that's not an idle statement, because we know that more than one woman a week in Australia is killed by a current or former partner.
That's right. That's right. So how we navigate that space as clinicians is really, really important.
Yeah.
And we've got to keep in the back of our mind that this person in front of us, the female victim, she's been managing this for a long time, and she's still with us.
Yeah.
She's managed to maintain herself. Now, we can imagine different client presentations with different types of substances and different other what shall I say, privileges or benefits of life that may or may not have been bestowed upon them, really accumulate to her having developed strategies to resist the violence for so long. And the idea of leaving is just too difficult in the sense of fear, for the fear of it.
So is there a time frame of the highest risk post-leaving? I mean, I've heard it said that the first 3 months is the highest risk. Is that a valid statement, or?
I've heard it 6 months. Yeah. It's a good question. They do know. We do know. The violence has every chance of increasing post-separation. And just because they're separated for a few months doesn't mean the risk is really reducing.
Yeah, it doesn't. It actually increases.
Yeah, and at those times, what can typically happen, though, is that separation might occur by default through an incident happening at home, through the partner or a neighbour potentially calling police, police arriving, issuing a safety notice, removing the male partner, and that leads to a full intervention order potentially, and that order could go for 12 months, could go for 5 years, just depending on how the courts see the risk. So while that intervention order is in place, that's when the risk is still apparent. And as you can imagine, when an intervention order lapses, the risk goes up as well. So time frame is very difficult to really ascertain to lessen the risk.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people sitting dreading the lapse of an intervention order.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What we try and work with these days is when we work with men is checking out and making them aware of what they're obliged to do with respect to the intervention order. It's a legal document. They're obliged to comply with it. So when it says various exclusion requirements or not to be drug affected when they're trying to relate to an ex-partner, now these are all it's important information to give our male clients so that they're fully aware and will at least accept some of the legal responsibilities around it.
Yeah. So it's not an intervention order is not something to be trifled with.
And it can easily be dismissed by the client, and we've got a potential to collude with that as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about self-harm, suicide attempts on the part of the perpetrator of family violence. That paradoxically is a high risk factor.
Paradox, that's right.
So wanting to kill myself means that I'm also more likely to kill my partner.
Yes. And that's a high risk factor for his behaviour. It's a factor that us clinicians want to embrace, we want to work with, we want to do suicide risk assessments on, whether it's suicide ideation or attempts. Try and mitigate through callback, contact. But what we also need to understand is perhaps the further context of that suicide attempt. And it could be in conjunction with the risk of the partner saying, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Unless you sort yourself out, I'm out of here or you're out of here. And then that suicide attempt is very much putting the responsibility, the emotional and psychological responsibility back onto her. And probably if it goes ahead, the threats are made often around, if you leave me, I'll kill myself. I can't look after myself. But if it goes ahead, then I'm sure there'd be that added layer of guilt associated with it. So it's in the context of other family violence factors and other situational issues such as separation. It's really a significant family violence factor. Often though we don't know the other factors, we only hear the suicide risk. So we as clinicians have got to keep that in the back of our mind. This could be part of a set of controlling behaviours.
And I suppose also when we're talking about this in terms of controlling behaviour, we also have to consider the concept of murder-suicide. If I can't have her, no one else can. So, again, it goes to the idea of possession, control, and then, when that veneer of power and control is destroyed, then we've got that shame, which then triggers the murder-suicide.
Yeah, and that's very much true of the children as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the sense of if children are involved, it could easily be the attitude of the perpetrator to say, the real way I'm going to get to you is through the children. It's through killing them.
Yes.
And that may or may not be a murder-suicide situation as well. But this is what all the research is pointing towards, the frameworks of understanding that add that extra lens to develop around our clients.
Yeah.
And as we're discussing these different risk factors, they're not all in isolation. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of overlap with many of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And depending on that combination, it's not as if they're all weighted differently.
No.
What we do is we combine all of them, basically add them up in terms of high and standard risk factors, apply our clinical judgment, perhaps do some information sharing around other services to see what other criminal activity might be happening. Plus, adopt an intersectional approach, such as other impacts, such as immigration or Indigenous Indigenous qualities. Are there regional aspects? The person might not live in the city, but in the regions. So all those go to play, and other racial, cultural issues. They will go into play as to what the risk ultimately becomes. So those risk factors are the initial indicators of the severity of, or the level of risk our clients are experiencing.
Yeah, it's important to understand that there's no hierarchy and that we're not actually talking in terms of a hierarchy. Yeah. So, I mean, another risk factor then would be the access to weapons or the use of weapons.
And when we picture that, we think of guns.
Yeah.
I guess that's probably the first cab off the rank. Knives.
Guns, knives, yeah.
We don't often think of things, say, as dogs as a weapon. We probably won't think of things as a car as a weapon, or any potential projectile. But certainly they're probably the major ones that come up in stories.
Yeah, DIY tools, hammers.
Yes. Yeah, being out in the shed contains a lot of potential weapons. So it's how we interpret that as well. If there's access to guns, cabinet, that's a clear. Well, having that access is pretty clear. If there's access to a hammer in the shed, well, was it used in an incident at some point? That could be really useful information to try and derive.
Yeah. What about unemployment or a reduction in employment?
Yeah. Yep, that's linked with as a high risk factor. Essentially what it means is the person's got more time to ruminate.
Yeah.
Less distracted, less committed to other obligations.
There's also a loss of status there, isn't it? So there's, as I said before, the destruction of the veneer and the exposure of shame. My identity was the man, the provider, and I was in control, and I controlled my partner. I had to keep her in line. And then I lose my job, I lose my identity, I'm more shameful, and then all of those negative feelings start welling up. The partner might still be in work.
And that disparity,
that
flipping of traditional roles,
yes.
and the maintaining of the traditional roles, traditional thinking, which is a known driver of family violence, can add to the frequency, add to the occurrence.
So earning less than your partner, or that change, if that's a change that you weren't expecting, I can start triggering feelings of shame.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a world of male privilege where we expect to earn more than our partners.
Yes, and depends on how well that particular man attaches himself to that old traditional thinking.
Yeah. One of the other things that I also trigger in a memory of mine is that it's not just unemployment. It's also having time, as you say, to consider the way in which you're going to cause that harm. You've got more time to plan. So there's an escalation of all of the behaviors that then ultimately lead to family violence?
It depends on what planning there is. It's an interesting way to look at it, as opposed to an attitudinal aspect.
Well, I mean, as you say, you cannot separate out completely, but they are all interlinked factors. But
yeah,
I suppose I would reflect on what you said. You're less distracted. When you're working, you're more distracted. You don't have the time to think about it quite so much.
Yeah, and as you say, still earning some money for the household, living up to those obligations. Whereas home, not looking after finances. Well, I guess at a minimum that will lead to some conflict and argument, and is often presented as a catalyst. But with family violence, we know there's a lot more behind it than just the incident.
Yeah. Arguments about money. I've had a couple of patients who talked about arguments about money. Yeah.
But I guess one thing that's dawned on me, Ferghal, in my time in the AOD space, and one of the factors we haven't talked about or mentioned is the drug and alcohol misuse. But I guess I was sort of thinking if our listeners can consider some patients they've had, clients they've had, who were drug affected, well, that would be all of them, because that's why they're coming to seek help. Potentially unemployed. Okay, that's probably a few of them as well. Potentially with mental illness. Well, that's probably pretty common.
Yeah. And
then we were sort of listed off three risk factors pretty readily. Then we've got the other ones around. Well, just had a. Now, what sort of relationship are they in? Are they in a family relationship? Do they talk of relational conflict? And how does that get managed? Have they got an intervention order? Meaning there has been an incident and police have been called out. So from my reckoning, it's very quick in the AOD space that our clients come already with very little inquiry on our part. They come with a set of risk factors already that talk about family violence, and we know there's a big overlap.
Yeah. So let's just be clear about it. AOD, drug and alcohol abuse, as you've said before, doesn't actually cause family violence. You can't blame violence on the drugs, but it acts as a magnifying glass and increases the frequency and the severity and also the risk of lethality associated with it.
That's right. That's right. And it's the substance use of the perpetrator, not of the victim.
Not of the victim. Yeah. Look, that's probably a good place to end it today. Thanks very much, Steve, and hopefully we can talk again soon. That's all for today, folks. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.